This morning's reading is from Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You who are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good morning. Thank you for choosing to join us this morning for our service of worship. Have you ever asked yourself this question? What will they say at my funeral? It's a sobering thought experiment, isn't it? What would it be like to be a fly on the wall as they are delivering your eulogy? Would you be proud of what was said? Would you cringe? If you knew that time was short, how would that change things? What choices would you make to the way your life is right now? David Brooks wrote a book a few years ago. It became a New York Times bestseller, although they all seem to these days, so I don't know what that means. It was called The Road to Character. And in that book, he talks about two types of virtues. He talks about resume virtues, the achievements, skills, and status, the things you bring to the job market, and they are important. I'm not belittling those. But he talks about a second set of virtues, and I'm interested by the word he chooses. He talks about them as eulogy virtues, because they're the things that people really remember when they're delivering your eulogy. Things like kindness, humility, and integrity. I guarantee nobody is going to stand up to deliver your eulogy and tell everyone how many air miles you had. But they may tell you how kind you were and how you made them feel. Jesus is nearing the end. He knows the road is running out. We are in Holy Week. Next Sunday we will start what is called the Passion narratives. And this is Jesus' last teaching to his disciples before we head on the road towards Good Friday and crucifixion, and ultimately Easter Sunday and resurrection. We are in the urgent and important quadrant. Some of you know what I mean, but if you plot things that are urgent on one axis and things that are important on the other, you end up with 4 quarters. There's stuff that isn't important and isn't urgent. And to be honest, why are you doing it then? There is stuff that is important, but it's not yet urgent, so kind of it gets pushed to one side. There's that stuff that feels really urgent, but it's not that important. And then there's the last quadrant, stuff that is urgent and important. And that's the stuff we really need to be focusing on. And that is where Jesus is today. I think there is an urgency to Jesus' message to us this morning. I find it interesting that Matthew bookends the teaching of Jesus with 2 of my favorite narratives in Scripture. He begins Jesus' teaching at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel with the Sermon on the Mount. If you can remember that a couple of years ago, it was a delight to preach our way through that passage. Foundational teaching. And I think Jesus ends here with, again, a foundational passage. And Matthew, as he's compiling the words of Jesus for his Gospel, bookends Jesus' teaching with these 2 passages. So we've spent the last 2 weeks, and this week 3 weeks in total, in Matthew 25, which is comprised of 3 parables. The first one you will remember, Chris preached on for us. It was the parable of the wise and foolish girls, or the wise and foolish virgins. And the message of that parable is be prepared. Then you get the parable of the talents. The master is away and he's left everyone in charge. And that is, look after things while I'm gone. And today we're at the last of those 3 parables. The story of the sheep and the goats. And Jesus begins, when the Son of Man comes in his glory. The Son of Man was a term that Jesus used for himself. He's using it from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate people one from another, as the shepherd separates separates the sheeps. It's the joke with my children, sorry, it's just sheep from the goats. And he'll put the sheep on his right-hand side and the goats on his left. I read a couple of commentaries this week and listened to a sermon where they made a great deal of the difference between sheep and goats. Their different traits, their different characteristics. To be honest, I think that is an utter red herring. It's a bit like trying to find the barn that they held, the father held the party in after the prodigal son came home. This is a narrative. This is a story. But I think why Jesus chooses sheep and goats is because it was an everyday example of sorting. Goats are hardier than sheep. Some argue they were more valuable because they have a higher milk yield. But every night when the shepherd would bring them in, and they would graze together on the hillside, and the shepherd would bring them in, he would have to bring the sheep in somewhere warm, particularly during the winter, because they wouldn't survive otherwise. Goats could survive left out overnight in a hardier climate. So when he'd bring them in, he'd leave the goats out and separate them and bring the sheep in. Other people try to read this story as a kind of a literal depiction of the end of time. As if someone had a video camera and we were now watching the cine film back of what it's going to be like. I think this is a story about judgment, absolutely. But it is a story. I used to get uncomfortable preaching on stories about judgment and the end times. They never sat comfortably with me. I don't know about you these days, but I'm longing for God's judgment in some places in this world, aren't you? Honestly, that's been a real shift. I used to feel so uncomfortable preaching about judgment. And now I find myself, because judgment in biblical terms is not to be best understood simply as punishment. It is judgment to put things right. That God in his judgment will restore things to the way they should be. At which point I want to say, judge away, God, please. Put things right. But I think Jesus is telling us this story because of the sense of urgency. He is setting his teaching in the context of the end times, not for that per se, but because it should make a difference to us now. Because this gives it urgency and importance. It reminded me of a book I read a few years ago by Oliver Burkeman that I thoroughly enjoyed. Now, off the top of your head, without doing any maths, just intuitively, how many weeks do you think you have to live or enjoy? Hold that in your head. Most people, apparently, when they asked that question, their immediate gut estimate was 30,000. Oliver Burkeman's book is entitled 4,000 Weeks. He doesn't tell that story to depress us, to make us feel despairing. It is to point out that life is finite, so therefore precious and valuable. What are you going to do with your 4,000 weeks? Or 1,800 weeks in my case. This is a quote from the book. The only real question about all this finitude is whether we're willing to confront it or not. Living a truly authentic life, becoming fully human, means facing up to that fact. We must live our lives to whatever extent we can in clear-eyed acknowledgement of our limitations. Life is not a dress rehearsal. Every choice requires myriad sacrifices, and time is already running out. Indeed, it may run out today, tomorrow, or next month. And so it's not merely a matter of spending each day as if it were your last, as the cliche has it, but the point is always that it actually might be. I think that is the sense of urgency that Jesus is instilling in his teaching, that Oliver Burkeman captures there by reflecting on our finitude. It's Soren Kierkegaard who asks the question in his book, what is worthy of your finitude? If life is limited, how are we going to spend it? And it's into that context that Jesus gives us criteria for living well. How do we get on the side of the righteous? How do we get on the side of the sheep? What matters most? Just remember that in the background of this parable, there is this clash between him and the Pharisees. He is pointing out differences between his disciples and the Pharisees here, I think. But this is what Jesus says matters in a sense of urgency. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care for me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. What does Jesus tell his disciples in this moment of urgency as he is about to leave them and head towards the cross? Feed the hungry, visit the prisoner, welcome the stranger, Treat them as you would treat me. In fact, I think the question that sits behind that is, can you see the image of God in the least and treat them as you would treat Jesus? Which is, treat them as you would treat a king. Are you able to see the image of God in each person before you and treat them in the light of that? Who here has anyone here met royalty? Anyone met the Queen or the King, perhaps in recent months? That feeling where you get dressed up, where you know they're important. What about your barista who makes your coffee on the run to the station in the morning? They are equally valuable children of God. And that is Jesus' point. Can you see the least? The waiter or waitress who's just served your meal. And as you treat them and as you thank them, can you treat them and see the image of God and treat them as you would treat Jesus, as you would treat a king? I think this was a profound, defining moment at the beginning of Pope Francis's ministry. Was when he welcomed a group of refugees to Italy on Maundy Thursday, knelt before them and washed their feet. Of course, echoing Christ. But here's the Pope, who lives in all the splendor of the Vatican, with all the gold and trappings and chefs and resources, kneeling to kiss the feet of a refugee because they are made in the image of God. Friends, how we live matters. I came across this book as I started studying at Durham a couple of years ago, talking about God in practice. And it's interesting because it uses a phrase that I'd not heard before. It talks about lived theology. It identifies in the book 4 different types of theology. There's academic theology, the things that in dusty books that people in universities like to argue over. Is it this theological idea? Is it that theological idea? And many, many pages have been spent arguing on what theology should look like. There is institutional theology, what the church says it is, largely from the creeds downwards. Faith looks like this, and here's a creed to define it. And then there's us, and then there's what we say we believe. Our espoused theology is the word that's used. If somebody asks you what you believe, what answer do you give them? You say, this is what I believe. It's interesting, lived theology talks about a 4th area of theology. That's if we examined your life, looked at that, what would it betray about what you believe? And what's interesting in the area that I'm studying is often these 4 are held up against each other in comparison. What the academy says, what the church says, what people say, and then what they do. And what's interesting is the most honest one is what people do. Because that betrays what you really believe. How we live matters. And that is what Jesus is saying, how we treat the least important, the overlooked, the prisoner, the refugee, that matters. At which point some of you are going there, well, Charlie, isn't this just salvation by works? You know, the age-long debate that's gone on in the church. Is salvation through faith in Christ or through works? Which is it? And do you know what? I read this passage in Matthew, and it sounds and smells like faith by works. That's what it looks like. And I can't cut it any other way. Matthew appears to be saying that you will be sorted in the end times as sheep and goats based on what you do. But I don't think that's all of it. You see, when I think of theology, when I think of the Bible and the theological conversation, I imagine it as a big table. Okay, it's a big table, and around that table is Matthew, and there's Paul, And there's James, and there's Peter, and there's Augustine and Luther, and there's you, and there's me. And we're sat around that table. And Matthew pipes up and he says, you remember when Jesus said, just as you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. And Paul over the other side of the table says, but no, Matthew, it's by grace that you've been saved through faith. It's not your own doing, it's the gift of God. It's not the result of work so that you can't boast. Well, then James, sat on the other table, pipes up and says, come on, guys. You know that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. At which point Peter's really irate. And he chimes in with, believe in him and rejoice. You're receiving the outcome of your faith for the salvation of your souls. And around this table, there's this discussion about Jesus' teaching. Friends, the Bible is not univocal. That means it doesn't speak with one voice. And I think you only have to read it moderately seriously to discover that. But actually the Bible is an invitation into a conversation and a discussion around this table. And here's Matthew, and here's Paul, and here's James. And for me, that's exciting. That doesn't bother me. It just is the reality, I think. And we're invited into this discussion. And I'll tell you where I get to with all of this, where I was chipping into this conversation. Not that I would want to sit at the table or open my mouth in such company, but if I were asked to, guys, it's about integrity. It's about ensuring that what you say matches what you do. If I'm listening to you talking, you're both right and you both matter. It's not sufficient to just say you believe this, because if it doesn't come out in your lived theology, well, what is it? It's James's point, faith without works is dead. But if you're striving and constantly working and thrashing yourself for approval, then you need to listen to Paul. Because Paul says it's through what Christ has done that you're saved. The point is we hold them both in tension. Enough of this theology nonsense. Let's bring this plane into land, shall we? So I think Jesus' teaching in Matthew 25 is urgent, it is important, it is pressing. He uses this illustration of judgment and sorting in the end of times because it matters now. Because that vision is supposed to affect how we live now, how we live today, how we treat the weak and the vulnerable. But one new thing struck me as I was preparing for this sermon, and I probably preached this passage 2-3 times before, and I missed this, and I loved it when it jumped out at me. Then the righteous will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, gave you food, or thirsty, and gave you something to drink? And the unrighteous will also answer, when was it that we saw you? They were both ignorant of the fact. They were completely unaware. And Jesus is pointing out to them. And you can imagine the unrighteous, the goats in this picture saying, but Jesus, if we'd have known it was you, we'd have treated you differently. And Jesus is saying, well, they didn't know either. They just treated ordinary people with no extrinsic motivation as if they were made in the image of God and worthwhile. What matters most? It's not exciting, it's not glamorous. But I think Jesus is pointing to what we might just call ordinary kindness. So ordinary that it becomes part of what we do in our lives each day, that actually it doesn't get attention drawn to it. We're not going to win any awards. We're not going to herald it with any great acclaim. But it's just about going through our lives, treating the people in front of us as if they are made in the image of God with kindness and compassion. So what might Jesus say to us if we were on that plane before him? It's when you spent that time each week to meet up with that person who was struggling with a relationship, and you walked with them for an hour a week, and you gave up your time and you listened to them. That was when you did it to me. When you gave your time to sit with somebody who was grieving, to sit with somebody who was lonely and hold their pain, just because it was the right thing to do. That was when you did it to me. When you provided for the neighbor who you knew was running out of food. So you went on your shop and you bought an extra bag and you dropped it and left it on their doorstep. That was when you did it for me. Ordinary acts of kindness. And something within me loves that, because it makes it attainable and reachable. How do we live out our faith? How do we express our gratitude for Jesus and for all that he's done? How do we respond out of that? You should sell your house, give all the money to church and go to the mission field. Well, maybe some of you should, but that's not what Jesus says here. He says just live life well. Being kind to the least, the marginalized, the overlooked, the grieving, the suffering, and the struggling. Treat them with dignity. Treat them as you were meeting the King. Ordinary acts of kindness. Friends, thank you. I want to finish with a video clip. Apologies to those on the stream. You can Google this. You'll pick it up on YouTube afterwards if you want to watch it, because we're going to have to mute the sound for copyright reasons. But whenever I think of this advert just comes to mind. It's from about a decade ago. I watched it as I was preparing my sermon last night and found myself in my study just sobbing quietly. Because it's just a beautiful illustration of what I think I'm trying to talk about. So turn your eyes to the screen and let's watch this together.